Welcome to Mind, America's Lignite Energy Podcast, brought to you by the Lignite Energy Council of North Dakota. Here's your hosts, Kate Muggerud and Geoff Simon.
All right, and welcome you guys. Thank you for joining us on Season 2, Episode 2 here on Mind, Lignite Energy in America. We are so happy to have all of you listeners and now our viewers back. I am joined here with my co-host, Geoff Simon. Geoff, say hi.
Hi, everybody.
And today, you guys know he's a guest that's been on the show a couple different times, and I'm just so honored and glad to have him back. Love visiting with him. Jason Bohrer from Lignite Energy Council, who are our lovely sponsors of the program, but he's the president and CEO. And today we're going to kind of dive in to some issues that we touched on in Season 1, but we're specifically going to kind of go back over here in Season 2. So Jason, welcome. Glad to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is great.
Yes, awesome. So video is a little different. We've kind of seen a shift in the podcasting world of it just being all audio to now video. So we can't do these podcasts in our sweatpants anymore. As I was so used to. So there's my secret from Season 1 to all our listeners is I may have been wearing sweatpants in some of them, but so Jason, thanks for joining us, and we're really, really glad to have you here. One of the things that we wanted to dive into, and before we kind of go into what we're going to discuss for our new listeners, our new viewers, our program here, our podcast here, really is just about diving into all things energy. And I know, Jason, you're very familiar with it as the sponsor of the podcast. We decided to start this podcast to really kind of start a entry-level understanding or diving into some of these topics that are so relevant and prevalent in our world today, and especially the things that we're dealing with in the United States and globally. For somebody like me who has no experience in the industry, to understand them better, to be able to speak into them, or how it affects my day-to-day. So for our new listeners, our new viewers, that is the purpose of this podcast. That is why we started it. And I have great guests with me each week, and now a fantastic co-host that is incredibly more smart than I am on this. And so I have a little less weight on my shoulders now. So Geoff, I'm glad to have you.
Happy to be here.
But all right, cool. So we'll dive in here. Jason, what has been going on in your world? How are things over at the Lignite Energy Council?
It's been kind of a crazy few weeks between the things that are going on in the energy world at the federal level, at the local level, and then you throw in the pandemic. It's been a busy 6 weeks. And one of the first things we learned is how critical energy workers are during a period of time like this. Everybody's at home, working from home, streaming video for work, watching video in their recreation time, and all that is necessarily dependent upon electricity production. And one of the things we did was work to get coal miners designated as critical essential infrastructure workers. So right when things got shut down, they could immediately go back to the mines and help power this country. So from the start of the pandemic, it's been a weird few weeks, and there's a lot going on.
I didn't even think about that in terms of, obviously all of our viewers here are going through the same thing with the coronavirus and all of this new work from home that we're dealing with. I mean, again, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for those essential workers. And often I feel like those might be overlooked, right?
Yeah, they were even overlooked by the presidential administration, because when this thing first hit, power plant workers were designated as essential critical infrastructure workers, which meant they weren't necessarily subject to the stay-at-home orders and some of these other things. And so the power plant workers were designated, but the coal miners were not. And so in North Dakota, those things have such a close relationship. So we started sending some letters and phone calls, and it wasn't just us, it was the industry out here, North American Coal, BNI, and several other people started making those. And it didn't take too long for the administration to say, hey, wait a minute, we got to make this right. And then those
Sure.
coal miners were also received that designation so they could go to work.
Hmm. Yeah, interesting. Geoff, what do you think about all this?
Well, it's just kind of crazy to see the world turned upside down, and people start referring to the COVID-19 and wearing of masks as the new normal. From my perspective, I certainly hope not. I hope we can get back to a day when people can hug and shake hands and things like that. For now, it's kind of the reality we're coping with, and I think that the next few months are going to be interesting to see the fallout from this, and how industry recovers, industry and commercial businesses, and the whole economy.
Yeah.
Because it certainly had an impact, and I know that Jason, you can probably speak to the impact here in North Dakota that the downturn in the oil industry has had on electric demand. I mean, it's had a big impact.
Yeah, you throw that in and you've got kind of this triple whammy, which is first thing, seasonal decrease in demand. The spring and the fall are generally not times of high demand for the electricity industry because there's not heat waves where you need electricity. There's not cold snaps where you need electricity for heating. So you're already in this area of decreased demand. And then on top of that, you have the oil industry crash. The price falls out of the bottom of the oil market, which means you're not using electricity. And then the third thing is this COVID. So then you've got industries, manufacturing shutting down, businesses aren't powering up. And so there's another drop off in demand. And on top of that, utilities can't just be shutting people's electricity off willy-nilly in this situation. So there was even a federal response to try and backstop some of the monies that the utilities were losing because they were not trying to shut as many people off and shut the power off. So it was really, from the utility perspective, unprecedented changes to what they are normally dealing with. Bad time of year on top of things, it all could have gone sideways, but our workers and our industry made it happen. And I would bet that if you're living in your home right now, you wouldn't have even noticed the 24/7 work that was going on from the mines and the power plants to make your world normal.
That's part of the problem that the industry has, Jason. It's so efficient and so reliable that we take it for granted, and that, that's honestly a concern that it may not always be that way, especially when we start adding some of these intermittent sources to the grid. We've had periods when we were on the edge of blackouts or rolling brownouts in some of these times when 20 below zero, 30 below zero. We need the reliability of coal for sure to continue for decades to come, perhaps.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, that is a great point. The fact that we expect these things are things that to, someone like me, these are essential. I need energy and power to have these meetings, to have my lights turn on. You don't think for a second that what the impact is going to be. Maybe I might not be able to have that or use these things. So I think, that's a great point, Geoff, saying the industry is so reliable, and that's something that we need to be reminded of, because we only realize we take things for granted when they're not there. And hopefully that will never be the case,
Right.
So that's such a great point. So, and now you just shared with me this morning, Jason, that, your offices are slowly opening back up now and people coming back to life kind of.
Yeah. I tell people the first 6 weeks or 4 weeks of working from home, everybody's excited about it. It's all new. But pretty soon you start thinking, okay, let's try and get back to a sense of normalcy. So we opened our office back up this week. We're getting people back in. Everybody's not in the office yet, but they will be shortly. And, the great thing about technology is if you work at it, the solutions allow you to be as productive as you were before. It's not as easy as it was before. And that's what we're finding is we're able to get everything done. The mission of the Lignite Council continues. But being able to do that collaboration and those partnerships, and just for me, it's easier being at work than it is at home. Some people love working at home. For me, it's a little easier when I'm in the office. So glad to be back.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, we're kind of discussing here. I want to dive into some of the questions that I had here this week. So one of the things that I want to talk about and kind of dive into is, the playing field of the energy generation has been tilted for some time towards renewables, right? So can you kind of give us a little background on why the policy makers chose that course specifically? And I know that's kind of a big question to answer.
Yeah, I look at that and say, from a policy perspective, there's two main reasons why you'd tilt a playing field, or why you'd create an incentive. And one of those reasons is to spur technological development. And I think that's a legitimate reason. You know, you've got technology that, from a national perspective, you want your natural resources to be able to stretch as far as they can and generate as much wealth and prosperity as they can. So it's in our nation's best interest to create and incentivize solutions that allow us to get more out of those natural resources. And so what policies have been enacted over the years, some of them are directly geared toward allowing us to better understand how to utilize scarce technologies. And, you know, you look at a chart of incentives, everything is benefited at some point or another from these types of incentives, whether it's the nuclear industry and waste disposal, whether it's the coal industry and carbon capture, whether it's a production tax credit for some renewables. Those incentives exist to drive the technology forward. And then there's another rationale that is often given, which is, hey, XYZ is bad for the environment. Therefore, we need to incentivize another source of energy that is better for the environment. So right away, you get this challenge, which is who defines what good or better is in terms of the environment. And what we've seen is over the past 20 years, there's been a real focus on carbon dioxide emission. And I think it's a little out of scale with what the damage and what the risk is associated with CO2 emissions. It's been overly weighted towards CO2 at the expense of some other environmental concerns. But the result is, between incentives to push technology forward and incentives that are based on environmental rationale, you've got this tilting playing field that has gone way against coal. And you're starting to feel it in the marketplace. You've been feeling it in the marketplace for a decade now.
Yeah.
I think we've been seeing it even longer than that, Jason. The the production tax credit, I believe, was first put into place in 1992 and extended. And back in 2016, there was federal legislation to phase it out, and yet we saw one more extension. It's like, when is wind supposed to be a mature technology?
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, which is, you go back to my first rationale. These exist to push the technology forward. Well, the technology is pretty mature. In fact, if you open up the literature from the wind industry, they'll tell you, hey, we're competing with coal, we're beating coal. We are the first choice, the cheapest choice. So if that's true, then why do they keep coming back and needing more incentives from the government?
Exactly.
I mean, those two things are incompatible with the truth.
Yeah, I completely agree. You see more things too in the news and in the media about it as well. And everybody knows how you can, you need to be very unbiased as you read things and take things with a grain of salt and do your own research. And I think if people would do their own research, they would see, like you said, the disparity between those comments and how, no, we are, steady in our longevity. And so it's interesting that you say that, because I do believe that's true.
One thing, Jason, I think that, the duration of the production tax credit, it was initially created to incentivize wind generation, but over the course of time here, I think I liken it to not a production tax credit to incentivize wind, but because those who are concerned about the effects of carbon dioxide on the climate are unable to pass a carbon tax in this country, the production tax credit is the next best thing. And unfortunately, today it's not so much being used to prop up wind as it is to harm the coal industry. We've seen that in some places.
Mm-hmm.
Great point. And then you go back to where we started this conversation. We always ought to be able to point to a policy rationale for things that Congress does. And the policy rationale should never be to harm another industry. And yet Geoff is right. The policy rationale right now behind the scenes on production tax credit is to kill off the coal industry. He's absolutely right.
Absolutely.
Well, I think,
go ahead.
I was going to say, when you look at the capacity markets right now, we have way more generating capacity, or at least a comfortable margin of generating capacity as is, and yet we still continue to see subsidized wind in making an incursion into the market at the expense of coal, because it's it jumps to the front of the queue with the regional transmission organizations. It's dispatched first because the energy is quote unquote free. Another distortion in the market, really.
Right.
Yeah. No, just what I was going to say, just for some of our viewers here, can you explain very simply kind of what the production tax credit is or how it works? When we kind of jumped into it here, but I want to make sure they understand what that is.
Yeah, so I'll take a crack at it. The production tax credit is a tax credit that is paid out as you put wind into service. So if the cost of a project is $1, the federal government is paying you, say, 75 cents to put that project into production. And that money is coming out of the nation's tax coffers, and it's going directly into the pockets of these wind producers. And so that's kind of the basics of how that production tax credit works. When you do something, produce wind, you get a tax credit on the back end. So if you're, we use it as, we had an example of if you have a lemonade stand and somebody's paying you 75 cents for every glass of lemonade that you sell, well, you could sell your lemonade pretty cheap if somebody's paying you 75 cents every time you do that. And so that's the example we use. It's pretty simple to understand. I don't know, Geoff, if you had additional thoughts on how that works or additional clarification.
Well, one thing I find interesting to the point I previously made there about, we're actually building more capacity than is required. Wind has pretty much produced itself or built itself out of the North Dakota market right now. We've seen, we're at a point where the transmission capacity is no longer there to move these electrons. And most of the wind that is generated in North Dakota ultimately moves out of state. So in order to continue to see more wind development, I think we're going to have to see perhaps hundreds of millions invested in transmission infrastructure. So maybe wind has played itself out of the market, Jason. I don't know.
Yeah, it may have. And you get to that point again, electricity is such a weird topic to talk about because it's different than any other thing. You produce it, transmit it, and consume it all at the same time. You don't put it in a warehouse anywhere. And so one thing is what Geoff's talking about, this capacity. Generally, to make an analogy, you want the capacity in your vehicles to be able to get you from point A to point B at any given time. Once you have that, you quit buying cars unless you're a collector, but you don't just keep buying cars that are all the same. You quit. When you can get where you need to go, you quit buying cars. But you know what? If somebody's paying you $40,000 to buy a $30,000 car, man, you'd keep buying those cars until they were stacked up on your lot and the road, you didn't have a parking lot big enough to hold them. That's what Geoff's getting to, is our parking lot is full. We don't have any more spots to get electricity out of North Dakota. And
people are paying for this redundancy too, Jason. And the cell line is that wind is cheap and or getting cheaper and that sort of thing. But I doubt that you would find anyone in the Northern Plains or Upper Midwest who would tell you that their electric bill has gone down recently.
Yeah.
It's adding to the cost ultimately that everyone pays for their electricity.
It is not free.
Yeah. I mean, I can speak to that as a consumer. That's definitely, I've only seen it increase there. So, when we're talking about this, what are some of the things that specifically the Lignite Energy Council is doing to level that playing field, if you will?
Yeah, so one of the things that we've done is we've joined MISO, which is the regional group that coordinates the transmission grid and the dispatch of electricity. And we've joined that group to raise our voice to say, you're considering price, you're considering carbon footprint, but you're not considering reliability and resilience to the degree that you should be. And here's why that's important. So we've joined that group to just kind of raise our banner for resilience, for reliability, for baseload power, and make sure that we have a mechanism that is fair to everybody in the market. We're also engaging in efforts to create new markets for coal-fired electricity and for coal byproducts. So, if you're selling your electricity for $1, and then you can sell your CO2 for another 25 cents, and then you can sell carbon fiber for another $1, all of a sudden you have this series of economies that builds greater wealth, greater prosperity, and makes those coal plants themselves more affordable and more profitable to operate.
Just those concerns going on in other RTOs as well, PJM and SPP. Do you see efforts there to promote this resiliency? I think it's happening everywhere, right?
Yeah, it is. And what all the RTOs are seeing is that it's really pretty simple to integrate renewable intermittent resources. Intermittent resources is a better word than renewable, because there's some intermittency that isn't renewable and vice versa. But when they get about 25 to 35% of their electricity is intermittent, which means you can't count on it every day. You can't promise that it's going to be there 2 weeks from now. When you start seeing 30% of your electricity being intermittent, it really increases the complexity of what you're doing. It's really easy to juggle 2 balls or 3 balls. You start trying to juggle 5, 6, 7, it's really hard. And that's kind of the first 10, 15, 20%. It's seamless. After that, it adds cost, complexity, and that's when all of the RTOs are starting to see that right about now.
For our viewers, guys, RTO, tell them what that means.
It's a regional transmission organization, and they kind of used to be your power plant that you could see was probably giving you the electricity to run your house. It's a little bit more complex than that now, where the electricity, these power plants are essentially managed by a third party, and it's done for efficiency purposes, to share resources but over broader geographic areas. But that's what RTO does.
Okay. And then one more thing for our viewers here and myself. MISO, when you said MISO, what is that?
MISO, and it's the
MISO.
Midwest Independent System Operator.
Got it. Okay. When you said you joined it, I was just curious because I had not heard of that before.
Yep.
Okay. Awesome. Cool. Yeah, very, very interesting, and good explanation of kind of how that is. And it seems like a lot of work, that is done and needs to continue to be done to kind of level that playing field. But
there's a lot going on, and you know what, the world is a more complex place now than it was 25, 35, 45 years ago. You've seen things like blackouts, cyber attacks. Those things lead to the conclusion that we should have a more resilient and more coordinated grid. So the fact that we're using RTOs, independent system operators, that's a good thing for the most part, because it allows resources to be shared. It allows us to avoid some redundancies, but it comes at the cost of increased complexity. And it also comes at the cost of detaching what happens in Bismarck, North Dakota, from the governance of MISO, 1,000 miles away.
Sure. So, okay, now I kind of want to touch on, over the last couple of years, we've seen the closure of one plant and recently announced closure of 2 more. So what does this signal basically for the state's lignite energy?
Yeah, it's a good question. All of those situations are different. The Stanton station that closed didn't use North Dakota lignite coal. Heskett Station, which was announced to be closing in a couple of years, is a really old plant. And then Coal Creek, which was announced a couple of years from now, and that's the last one. I don't think you can draw a single conclusion from those 3 decisions, because all 3 of those decisions are based on very different data points. So I think the conclusion that you can draw is that markets are a lot different today than they were even 5 years ago. And that what we used to see happening in other parts of the country with coal-fired electricity is now happening in North Dakota. And the other conclusion is we have to recognize that as a state, that things are changing, and figure out, are there policy changes that we can come up with? Are there things that we can do as a state to put our industry on more stable footing? Because right now, it's an industry that is finally being touched very directly by changing markets. And those markets have been impacting the industry for many years now, but it was always something that happened behind the scenes that the general public probably wouldn't see. Well, now they're seeing it, now they're hearing it. So it's time to take a step back and look at what we can do as a state, as an industry, to realign that playing field.
Yeah, that's good to know, and a good explanation, because you don't hear kind of the background to that. You just hear one's closing, a couple more, what's going on. And so to hear the explanations for that kind of shows that that stability still there. So that's definitely something good to know. So what do you feel can be done to kind of strengthen that market for coal power generation facilities in your experience?
I think the first thing that you can do is something I talked about a little earlier, which is you have to recognize the value that resilience has inherently in a system. And I use this example that, every source of electricity essentially is priced the same way, even though every source of electricity has different values. There's different things that goes along with that. So if your electricity comes from wind, there are some people who also kind of put a plus up on that value and say, hey, the electricity is worth this much, but because there's no CO2, it's worth this much. Right or wrong, that's what our policies do. But what happens for coal is, you say the electricity is still worth that much, but it's on whenever you need it. You can count on it. You can schedule it for 2 weeks from now. That's worth something, and it's probably worth this much. But it's only getting this much in the market. So we have to figure out how to recognize the fact that the electricity is worth this much. The resilience factor is worth this much. The ability to dispatch it is worth this much. We have to have those conversations and figure out how to craft a system that recognizes the value of the electricity from every source and the other attributes that exist, and properly value them too. That's just one thing. We continue to look for ways to create new markets to capture CO2, sell it in the oil field. Right now, there's tax credits that exist if you capture that CO2 and just store it underground. That tax credit exists as an incentive to develop that technology. So we've got a limited window where we want to develop that technology and then allow it to develop its own market. And then the third thing, again, I referenced this a little earlier, which is there's so many other things that you could do with lignite coal. You can make it into carbon fiber. Graphene is a carbon product that's extremely valuable. And you can use that probably from North Dakota lignites, you could use it as a concrete additive. And you're talking, $30,000 a ton for this stuff. And then the other one that we talk about from time to time, you've talked about them, rare earth elements, things that go into high-tech devices, electronics, coatings. Again, there's another way to add value to what we're doing just with the basic coal industry right now.
Yeah. Geoff, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the one thing that you kind of always hear are the people that run the RTOs we talked about earlier, or the MISOs of the world, to address what Jason was pointing out, compensating the lignite industry for resiliency. The people who operate the RTOs understand the essence of reliability. We need to have 24/7 power. And they also say, well, coal needs to continue to be a part of that. But if we continue to see coal plant retirements because of the economics, or the economics aren't there, what do we have to do? I think we are seeing an increasing recognition among the RTOs and probably the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, where the solution really resides, that something has to be done, and has to be done pretty darn soon.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely can speak from a consumer standpoint, and somebody who, is learning about this industry, and I don't understand it to the depths both of you do. Reliability in this time of unpredictable, every day-to-day life that we have right now is so critical. I mean, I can't tell you as an American, as a North Dakotan, what it would be like if we did not have that reliability that we get with coal, because of all of the things that come from that. So I think that, it's something that we need to be talking about. We need to be reminded about and be, grateful for, because it is so reliable. And I know that my day-to-day is going to go on normally in terms of the things that our great coal provides to us.
It's pretty essential, because if you ever read what futurists say, they imagine a scenario if the United States was without electricity for even just 30 days, society would it would become chaos. It would be chaos. We wouldn't be able to preserve food. We wouldn't be able to do anything, communicate. Traffic couldn't be regulated by streetlights. It would be utter chaos. So, we need to appreciate electricity for sure.
Yeah. You see all the uncertainty over the past 6 to 8 weeks.
Right.
Imagine if electricity were as unreliable during that period as everything else. You go shopping right now, and half the time the meat's gone, other times the eggs are gone. Now imagine if your electricity was as sketchy as grocery delivery or supply has been. And the world gets a lot scarier.
A lot scarier than it is already. So, I mean, very grateful. And I'm glad that we touched on this, because I think it's a good reminder to our viewers of how important coal is to our world and our day-to-day. So, well, Jason, thanks so much for jumping on the show here, and we appreciate it. I know it's kind of our go-to is grabbing you and talking to you, just because you have so much wealth of knowledge that you can share with us. So I appreciate you joining us again.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This has been great. Thanks, Geoff.
Cool. Yes, you guys stay healthy and take care.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
See y'all.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Mind, America's Lignite Energy Podcast. For more information on lignite energy in North Dakota, visit lignite.com.